The dust stings my eyes as I stand where it all ended. Beneath my feet, these drainage pipes once hid a man who controlled an entire nation for 4 decades. I can almost hear the chaos, the fighter jets screaming overhead, the desperate radio calls, the shouting. October 20th, 2011. A day that began with a desperate convoy racing across the Libyan desert and ended with cell phone footage that shocked the world. I've spent years piecing together what really happened in those final hours. The satellite images, the classified communications, the testimonies of those who were there. What I discovered will change everything you thought you knew about the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. By October 2011, the coastal city of Sirte had become a prison for the man who once called himself King of Kings of Africa. Rebel forces had methodically tightened their grip on Gaddafi's hometown from all sides. North from the Mediterranean coastline, east and west along Highway 1, and south from the desert approaches. The noose was tightening day by day. For 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi had ruled Libya through fear, charisma, and brutal efficiency. Now he was reduced to moving between abandoned buildings under the cover of darkness, his world shrinking to just a few square blocks of a city in ruins. Mansour Dao, Gaddafi's longtime security chief, who survived the final days, later described a leader increasingly detached from reality. He would sit for hours listening to an old radio, Dao told investigators, sometimes laughing at news reports of his imminent capture, other times flying into uncontrollable rage. The dictator who once slept in palaces with gold-plated fixtures now rested on a thin mattress in an abandoned school building. His legendary vanity remained intact. Aides report he still dyed his hair and maintained his appearance despite the dire circumstances. But his grip on reality was slipping. He would ask about parades being organized in his honor, recalls one bodyguard who requested anonymity. He genuinely believed thousands of loyal supporters were about to arrive and push back the rebels. None of us dared tell him the truth, that most of Libya was celebrating what they thought was his death or escape from the country. In one intercepted phone call from October 17th, just 3 days before his death, Gaddafi can be heard demanding tribal leaders send reinforcements. Where are the men of inaudible? Did they forget who built their schools? Who brought them water? Tell them Muammar is waiting. Tell them their father is waiting. The response never came. As NATO airstrikes continued to pound loyalist positions day and night, Gaddafi's inner circle dwindled. Many fled or surrendered. Those who remained described a leader oscillating between defiance and delusion. He would quote from his green book for hours, says former aide Mohammed Bashir, then suddenly ask if his favorite camel was being properly fed at his compound in Tripoli, a compound that had been overrun months earlier. His final safe house was a stark 2-room concrete structure near Sirte's District 2. The windows were covered with blankets. A single generator provided intermittent electricity. Intelligence reports indicate he spent his final nights here, sleeping fully clothed, his gold-plated pistol, a gift from Saddam Hussein, always within reach. Ahmed al-Zlitni, one of the last government officials to see Gaddafi alive, described their final meeting. He sat on the floor eating rice with his hands. His famous sunglasses were cracked. He asked me about his legacy, whether history would remember him as a great man. Before I could answer, he said, "They will miss me when I'm gone. Libya needs Gaddafi." What Gaddafi couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge was that Libya had already moved on. The rebels had established a transitional government. Foreign powers were recognizing the new leadership. The Arab Spring that had begun in neighboring Tunisia had swept away his 42-year regime in just 8 months. Dr. Gerald Post, a former CIA psychological profiler who studied Gaddafi for decades, explains, "Dictators often develop what we call malignant narcissism. They cannot conceive of a world without themselves at the center. For Gaddafi, the idea that Libya could continue without him was not just frightening, it was incomprehensible. The man who once traveled with dozens of female bodyguards and pitched his Bedouin tent on the lawns of world leaders was now reduced to drinking rainwater collected in plastic containers. His satellite phones were used sparingly, as NATO signals intelligence was tracking any electronic emissions. He still believed he was beloved, says former bodyguard Mansour. Even as we heard rebel fighters just streets away, he spoke of addressing crowds again, of rebuilding Libya. It was as if he was living in a different reality. Among the few items recovered from his final hideout was a hand-drawn map of Libya with the words, "Always Mine," written in Arabic. Psychological experts suggest this reveals his inability to separate his identity from the nation he had ruled for so long. As food supplies dwindled and rebel forces moved building by building through Sirte, Gaddafi's inner circle faced a devastating choice: surrender, fight to the death, or attempt a desperate breakout. On the night of October 19th, with the sound of gunfire drawing ever closer, the decision was made. They would attempt to flee at dawn, making a run for the southwestern desert where loyal tribes might still offer sanctuary. Vehicles were prepared, weapons distributed. A convoy would punch through rebel lines while it was still dark. None of them would sleep that night. For most, it would be their last night alive. What if I told you that less than 10% of viewers who watch this documentary will ever know the full truth about what happened that day? Don't be one of them. Subscribe to Crime Frame now to ensure you never miss the hidden stories behind history's darkest moments. Dawn broke over Sirte on October 20th, 2011, a Thursday that would soon be etched into history. The first light revealed a city in ruins, smoke still rising from buildings struck during overnight bombardments. For Gaddafi and his remaining loyalists, the decision had been made. They would flee west, toward the desert expanses where tribal connections might offer sanctuary. The convoy assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. An impressive force of 75 vehicles gathered near Sirte's western edge. This wasn't a haphazard collection, but a deliberately organized escape attempt. At its core were 20 technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons. These formed a protective ring around a cluster of SUVs and armored vehicles carrying Gaddafi, his son Mutassim, and key members of his security detail. Flanking these were civilian vehicles, Toyota Land Cruisers, Mercedes sedans, even commandeered ambulances, carrying loyalist fighters, remaining government officials, and family members. The outer perimeter consisted of more technicals and several troop transport trucks filled with soldiers still loyal to the regime. The formation was actually quite sophisticated, explains Colonel Marcus Harper, former NATO operations analyst. It resembled tactics developed by South African security forces in the 1980s, designed to protect high-value targets while maintaining mobility. Someone in Gaddafi's circle had military training beyond the typical Libyan army doctrine. The plan was to break out at high speed, punching through rebel lines while they were still thin, then split into smaller groups once they reached open desert. These smaller units would be harder to track and could use different routes to reach loyalist tribal areas near the Algerian border. But the plan contained three fatal flaws. First, they had waited too long. Rebel forces had completely encircled Sirte, leaving no clear corridor for escape. Second, they underestimated NATO's surveillance capabilities. And third, perhaps most crucially, they failed to maintain communications discipline. High above the Mediterranean, a NATO E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft had been maintaining 24-hour surveillance of the region. These modified Boeing 707s serve as flying radar stations, capable of tracking hundreds of vehicles simultaneously across thousands of square miles. We had established what we called pattern of life monitoring, explains former RAF Wing Commander James Holden. We knew the normal traffic patterns in and around Sirte. Anything unusual, especially a large group of vehicles moving together at high speed, would immediately trigger alerts. At NATO's Joint Force Command in Naples, Italy, analysts had been working around the clock, processing intelligence from multiple sources, signal intercepts, human intelligence from rebel informants, drone footage, and satellite imagery. They had constructed a detailed picture of Gaddafi's diminishing options. We knew he was still in Sirte, says a former intelligence officer who requested anonymity. The question wasn't if he would try to escape, but when and how. The crucial breakthrough came at 3:42 a.m. local time on October 20th. A satellite phone call was intercepted between one of Gaddafi's bodyguards and a relative in Bani Walid, another loyalist stronghold. The call lasted just under 3 minutes, but it was enough. "We have the guide with us," the bodyguard said, using a common term for Gaddafi. "We are leaving at dawn. The route is prepared." The call was flagged by automated systems searching for keywords, then quickly translated and relayed to decision makers. Within minutes, surveillance assets were redirected to focus on western Sirte, 8,000 miles away at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. Drone operator Master Sergeant Kevin Calhoun, name changed for security reasons, was 7 hours into his 12-hour shift. The 39-year-old father of two had been flying MQ-1 Predator drones over Libya for months, part of Operation Unified Protector. It was supposed to be a routine surveillance mission. Calhoun later told investigators, Then everything changed. We received new tasking directly from AFRICOM. Priority target, possible HVT movement. HVT, high-value target, was the designation for Gaddafi. At 8:07 a.m. local Libyan time, Calhoun's Predator captured the first thermal images of vehicles gathering in western Sirte. The drone, flying at 25,000 feet, was invisible to those below. Its cameras recorded as vehicle after vehicle joined the formation. We counted initially 42 vehicles, then more arrived, Calhoun recalled. By 8:30, it was clear this wasn't normal civilian movement. The pattern matched convoy protocols used by Gaddafi's security detail. The information was relayed to the Combined Air Operations Center (CAOC) in Poggio-Renatico, Italy, where French, British, and American officers made the decision to scramble aircraft. At 8:35 a.m., two French Mirage 2000D fighter jets already on patrol over northern Libya were redirected towards Sirte. Simultaneously, a second Predator drone was deployed to maintain surveillance if the first needed to return to base for refueling. At 8:42 a.m., the convoy began to move, accelerating quickly towards Sirte's western outskirts. NATO had anticipated this route. It was one of only 3 viable options identified by analysts, and the only one that offered access to open desert. They were moving fast, says former NATO targeting officer Lieutenant Colonel Jean Deveau, approximately 70-80 kilometers per hour. The lead vehicles were firing at rebel positions as they went, creating a corridor for the main convoy to follow. By 8:55 a.m., the convoy had broken through the rebel perimeter and reached Highway 1, turning west toward Misrata. For a brief moment, it appeared the escape might succeed. In Nevada, Calhoun received new orders. His Predator, previously conducting surveillance only, was now authorized to engage. The drone was armed with 2 AGM-144 Hellfire missiles, precision weapons originally designed to destroy tanks. The authorization came directly from the highest levels, a former Pentagon official confirmed. There was no ambiguity in the orders. If we had confirmation that Gaddafi was in that convoy, we were cleared to strike. At 9:16 a.m., Calhoun positioned his drone ahead of the convoy's path. The targeting system locked onto the lead vehicles. Rifle, 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 Calhoun announced, the code word for missile launch. The first Hellfire streaked toward the convoy at over 950 miles per hour. 20 seconds later, it struck the lead vehicle, a technical mounted with a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun. The explosion was captured by the Predator's cameras. The technical disintegrated, and the vehicles behind it swerved chaotically, some colliding with each other as drivers attempted to avoid the burning wreckage. Moments later, the French Mirage jets arrived on station. Unlike the Predator with its precision missiles, the Mirages carried 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bombs, weapons designed to destroy hardened targets. The French pilots had been briefed that this was potentially Gaddafi's convoy, says former French Air Force Colonel Pierre Laforge, but their orders were to disable the convoy, not specifically to target Gaddafi himself. At 9:19 a.m., the first Mirage released its payload. The bomb struck the road approximately 50 meters ahead of the convoy, cratering the highway and forcing the vehicles to stop. A second bomb followed seconds later, this one striking among the vehicles themselves. The explosion destroyed 3 technicals and damaged several other vehicles. Thermal imaging showed human figures running from the burning wreckage. After the second strike, the convoy lost all cohesion. Calhoun recalled, it was no longer a single unit but dozens of vehicles scattering in different directions. Some vehicles attempted to continue west along the highway. Others turned back towards Sirte. A significant group, approximately 20 vehicles, including the one believed to be carrying Gaddafi, veered southwest off the highway, heading toward a residential area called District 2. By 9:25 a.m., what had begun as an organized escape attempt had devolved into chaos. The French Mirages, low on fuel, were replaced by NATO aircraft, including British Tornado GR4s and more French jets. These continued to strike vehicles that appeared to be part of the original convoy. It's important to understand that this wasn't a continuous bombardment, explains military analyst Dr. Sarah Kramer. The airstrikes were precise, targeting vehicles that posed a military threat, those mounted with heavy weapons or moving in tactical formations. But once the convoy scattered, identifying which vehicles contained Gaddafi became nearly impossible from the air. On the ground, rebel fighters who had been engaged with loyalist forces in Sirte heard the explosions and saw aircraft overhead. Using civilian phones and handheld radios, they spread word that Gaddafi might be trying to escape. "They're running. The rats are running," one rebel commander announced over an open radio channel. "All units to the western exit. Cut them off." Dozens of rebel vehicles converged on the area, approaching from multiple directions. What had begun as a NATO precision strike was about to transform into something far more chaotic, and for Gaddafi, far more personal. By 9:40 a.m., the vehicle believed to be carrying Gaddafi had reached the outskirts of District 2, a residential neighborhood of concrete apartment blocks and small villas. Here, the dictator would make his final stand, not in a palace or bunker, but in a drainage culvert beside an unremarkable road. The drainage system where Muammar Gaddafi spent his final moments as a free man was never designed for human occupation. Constructed in the 1980s as part of Sirte's infrastructure development, ironically, a project Gaddafi himself had inaugurated, these concrete culverts were built to channel rare but intense desert rainfall away from the coastal highway. The system consists of two parallel concrete pipes, each approximately 1.2 meters, 4 feet in diameter, running perpendicular beneath the road connecting District 2 to Highway 1. The pipes extend roughly 200 meters on either side of the road before opening into shallow concrete-lined channels. The entrances are partially obscured by scrub vegetation and accumulated sand, making them nearly invisible unless one knows exactly where to look. "These aren't sophisticated structures," explains civil engineer Dr. Mahmoud Khalil, who studied Libya's infrastructure development. "They're basic drainage culverts designed to prevent flash flooding during the rainy season. They would be completely dry most of the year." What makes these particular drainage pipes significant is their location. They sit at a critical juncture, close enough to the residential buildings of District 2 to be accessible from areas where loyalist forces had maintained control, yet offering a potential escape route toward open terrain to the south. It was a logical place to seek temporary shelter, says military tactician Colonel James Harrington. From a purely strategic perspective, the culverts offered concealment from aerial observation and protection from direct fire, but they also created a deadly trap if discovered. By 10:15 a.m. on October 20th, rebel fighters from Misrata had established positions throughout District 2. The NATO airstrikes had scattered Gaddafi's convoy, but rebel commanders received reports that several vehicles had entered the neighborhood. Yunus Amami, then a 24-year-old rebel fighter, recalls the chaotic scene. "We were moving building to building. There was still some resistance, loyalist snipers in a few positions. Then we heard over the radio that some of Gaddafi's men had been spotted near the western edge of the district." Ahmed al-Fattori, another rebel fighter, describes what happened next. "We saw 3 or 4 technicals armed pickup trucks trying to break through toward the south. We engaged them and they crashed near a villa about 200 meters from the main road. We approached carefully, expecting heavy resistance. What the rebels found instead were abandoned vehicles and signs of injured men being dragged away. Blood trails led toward the main road. We followed the blood," continues al-Fattori. "It led to the road and then seemed to disappear. Some of us thought they had been picked up by other vehicles. Others suggested they might have continued on foot into the desert." It was 23-year-old Mohammed al-Bibi who first noticed something unusual, a discarded pistol near the roadside. The gold-plated weapon was immediately recognizable to the fighters as one often carried by Gaddafi. "When we saw the pistol, everything changed," recalls Amami. "Suddenly, we weren't just fighting anonymous loyalists. We thought Gaddafi himself might be nearby." The rebels spread out, searching the area with renewed intensity. Some began checking nearby buildings, others scoured the roadside ditches. The discovery came almost by accident. "I saw a man disappear into what looked like a hole in the ground," says fighter Salem Baker. "At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Then I realized it was the entrance to a drainage pipe." By this time, approximately 40 to 50 rebel fighters had converged on the area. They approached the drainage pipe cautiously, aware that cornered loyalists might fight desperately. "Come out. We can see you," the rebels shouted. "Surrender now." There was no response from within the pipes. The rebels positioned themselves around both ends of the drainage system, effectively cutting off any escape. Some fighters volunteered to enter the pipes, while others provided cover. What happened next is pieced together from multiple eyewitness accounts, though some details remain disputed. Eamon Mast-Maf, one of the first rebels to look into the pipe, describes what he saw. "There were several men inside, huddled together. It was dark, but I could make out at least 5 or 6 figures. They were pressed against the sides of the pipe, trying to hide." The rebels again demanded surrender. This time, someone inside the pipe responded. "Don't shoot, don't shoot," a voice called out in Arabic. "We are coming out." The first to emerge was a bodyguard, hands raised. He was immediately seized by the rebels. Then another man appeared at the entrance, younger, well-dressed, despite the dirt and grime. This was Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator's son and national security advisor. As Muammar was pulled from the pipe and restrained, the rebels peered deeper into the darkness. That's when they saw him. The distinctive features of Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years, now crouching in a concrete drainage pipe. His face was unmistakable, says Al-Fattori. Even covered in dirt and blood, we all knew immediately who he was. It was like seeing a ghost, this man whose image had been everywhere in Libya. Our entire lives now hiding in a sewer pipe. According to multiple accounts, Gaddafi was in poor physical condition when discovered. He had a wound to his left temple, possibly from shrapnel during the earlier airstrikes. His clothing, typically flamboyant and immaculate, was torn and filthy. Most notably, he appeared disoriented. Dr. Ibrahim Tawati, who later examined video footage of Gaddafi's capture, notes, he shows signs of concussive injury, disorientation, unequal pupil dilation, and difficulty maintaining balance. These are consistent with proximity to an explosion or a fall. What happened next remains one of the most controversial aspects of Gaddafi's capture. As rebels moved to extract him from the pipe, someone, either a loyalist bodyguard or Gaddafi himself, accounts differ, allegedly activated a hand grenade. There was a sudden explosion inside the pipe, recalls Amami. Not very powerful, but in that confined space, the effect was amplified. There was smoke everywhere, and people were screaming. The explosion killed one bodyguard instantly and wounded several others, including rebels who had been approaching the pipe entrance. Gaddafi himself sustained additional injuries, including shrapnel wounds to his legs. Explosives expert Dr. Robert Wilkins, who analyzed available evidence, concludes, based on the injury patterns and damage to the concrete, this was most likely a defensive grenade designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The confined space of the drainage pipe would have magnified its concussive effect while limiting the spread of shrapnel. In the chaos following the explosion, rebels pulled Gaddafi from the pipe. Video footage captured on cell phones shows him dazed and bleeding, surrounded by shouting fighters. The footage, while grainy and chaotic, captures several crucial moments. Gaddafi is seen being dragged to his feet, clearly disoriented. His face shows a mixture of confusion and fear, expressions never before seen on the face of the brother leader, who had projected strength and defiance for decades. Most importantly, the footage captures fragments of dialogue between Gaddafi and his captors, words that reveal the psychological dimensions of this extraordinary moment. "What did I do to you?" Gaddafi is heard asking repeatedly in Arabic. "Don't kill me, my sons," he says at another point. "What have I done to you?" A rebel responds, "You know what you did to Misrata?" These exchanges, verified by multiple translators, reveal something profound about the dictator's final moments. A man who seemingly could not comprehend that his people had turned against him. This disconnect from reality is common among long-term dictators, explains Dr. Gerald Post, founder of the CIA's Psychological Profiling Unit. After decades of surrounding themselves with sycophants and eliminating dissent, they develop a distorted worldview where they genuinely believe their own propaganda. Gaddafi likely saw himself as Libya's father figure, making the hatred expressed by these young rebels incomprehensible to him. The cell phone footage, which would soon be broadcast worldwide, cuts off at critical moments. What it doesn't show is equally important as what it does. There are approximately 7 minutes of unrecorded time between the last verified footage of Gaddafi alive and the first images of his body being loaded onto a truck. What transpired during those minutes has been the subject of intense speculation and investigation. The video evidence is fragmentary, notes human rights investigator Maria Sanchez. We have the moment of capture, then brief clips of Gaddafi being moved toward a vehicle, then nothing until he appears to be deceased. Those missing minutes are crucial to understanding exactly how he died. What the footage does conclusively show is the chaotic, unplanned nature of the capture. This was not a carefully orchestrated military operation, but a chance encounter that quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. The behavior of the crowd shows classic signs of what sociologists call de-individuation, explains Dr. Emma Richards, expert in crowd psychology. In large groups, especially after prolonged conflict, individual moral restraint can break down. People who might normally behave with restraint find themselves caught up in collective action that none would undertake alone. The cell phone footage captured that day would become some of the most significant visual evidence of the Arab Spring's violent culmination. Yet for all its apparent transparency, it raises as many questions as it answers. Every day, thousands of viewers scroll past videos like this, missing crucial information that could change their understanding of world events. The feeling of regret when you later discover what you missed is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Hit subscribe on Crime Frame now, before this video disappears from your recommendations forever. To understand the raw emotion that exploded on that roadside in Sirte, we must first understand Misrata, the city whose fighters captured Gaddafi and the brutal siege they had endured just months earlier. Misrata, Libya's third largest city and commercial hub, had special significance in Gaddafi's fall. When the revolution began in February 2011, Misrata was one of the first cities to rise against the regime. Gaddafi's response was merciless. He told us directly, "I will show you what I'm going to do to Misrata," recalls former regime insider Abdullah Sanasi. He said, "I will make an example of them that no one in Libya will ever forget." Beginning in March 2011, Gaddafi's forces encircled Misrata, cutting off electricity, water, and food supplies. What followed was the longest and bloodiest siege of the Arab Spring, 68 days of continuous bombardment, using weapons designed to maximize civilian casualties. Dr. Khalid Abu Falga, who worked at Misrata Central Hospital throughout the siege, describes the horror. They used cluster munitions in residential areas. They fired mortar rounds containing hundreds of ball bearings, weapons designed specifically to tear through human flesh. We treated children whose bodies were riddled with these metal balls. The siege tactics grew increasingly barbaric as Gaddafi's forces failed to recapture the city. Snipers positioned on rooftops specifically targeted children, pregnant women, and the elderly. Water treatment facilities were deliberately destroyed, creating a sanitation crisis. By April, we were performing surgeries without anesthesia, continues Dr. Abu Falga. We amputated limbs using hacksaws, sterilized with boiling water. Patients bit down on leather belts to manage the pain. It was medieval. The psychological impact on Misrata's population was profound. An estimated 1,000 civilians died during the siege, including 686 men, 241 women, and 143 children under 14. Thousands more were wounded, many suffering life-altering injuries. Professor Claire Williams, expert in conflict psychology, explains, "The Misrata siege created what we call collective trauma, an emotional wound shared by an entire community. This type of experience fundamentally alters how people process information and respond to threats. It creates a powerful us versus them mentality and can significantly lower inhibitions against violence when confronting those perceived as responsible." By the time Misrata's fighters reached Sirte in October 2011, they had been fighting Gaddafi's forces continuously for 8 months. Many had lost family members. All had witnessed atrocities. They weren't just fighting to overthrow a dictator. They were seeking retribution. "You have to understand what these young men had lived through," says conflict journalist Maria Colvin, who embedded with Misrata brigades. Many were ordinary students, shopkeepers, and office workers who had taken up arms to defend their families. They had watched friends die. They had pulled children's bodies from rubble. When they found Gaddafi, it wasn't just a military objective. It was a deeply personal reckoning. This context is crucial for understanding what happened after Gaddafi was pulled from the drainage pipe. The men who captured him weren't dispassionate professional soldiers, but civilian fighters carrying profound psychological wounds. The verified footage, analyzed frame by forensic video experts, shows Gaddafi being dragged from the drainage pipe at approximately 12:33 p.m. local time. He appears dazed with a visible wound to his left temple. His designer desert-colored shirt is torn and blood-stained. Within seconds, he is surrounded by dozens of fighters, many filming with cell phones. The crowd grows rapidly as word spreads. Fighters can be heard shouting, "Allahu Akbar, God is great, and we got him." What we're seeing here is a textbook case of de-individuation, explains social psychologist Dr. Philip Zimbardo. In large groups, especially after prolonged conflict, individual identity becomes subsumed by collective identity. Moral restraints that govern normal behavior can rapidly break down. At 12:34 p.m., the footage shows Gaddafi being pushed against the hood of a vehicle. He appears to be pleading with his captors. Blood is visible on his face and head. Multiple hands grab at him, some appearing to strike him while others seem to be trying to shield him. The audio is chaotic, with multiple people shouting simultaneously, notes forensic audio analyst Thomas Reynolds. But we can clearly distinguish Gaddafi saying, "What did I do to you?" several times. There's genuine confusion in his voice, as if he truly doesn't comprehend why these people hate him. At 12:36 p.m., fighters begin moving Gaddafi toward a pickup truck. This is where the most continuous video segment ends. What follows are fragmented clips from multiple phones, creating a disjointed record with significant gaps. Dr. Ibrahim Tawadi, who analyzed the available footage, identifies several distinct injuries. There's the initial head wound, likely sustained during the airstrike or the grenade explosion in the pipe. There are also abrasions consistent with being dragged across rough ground. Most concerning are the apparent puncture wounds to the torso visible in later footage, which don't appear in the initial capture videos. The official autopsy, conducted after Gaddafi's body was taken to Misrata, listed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. However, independent forensic experts who reviewed the available evidence have questioned this conclusion. There's approximately 7 minutes of unrecorded time between the last verified footage of Gaddafi alive and the first images of his body being loaded onto a truck, notes human rights investigator Carlos Mendez. During those critical minutes, something happened that transformed a captured, injured, but very much alive Gaddafi into a deceased one. Multiple accounts from fighters present that day offer conflicting explanations. Some claim Gaddafi was caught in crossfire between loyalists and rebels. Others suggest he was shot while trying to escape. A few admit that fighters, overcome by emotion, may have executed him. "I was there, but I didn't see who fired the shot," says one fighter who requested anonymity. "Everyone was shouting. People were pushing to get closer to him. Then suddenly there was more blood, and he wasn't moving anymore." From an international law perspective, the treatment of Gaddafi, regardless of his own crimes, raises serious questions. Professor of International Humanitarian Law, Diana Orentlicher, explains, "Under the Geneva Conventions, captured combatants, including leaders, must be protected from violence and treated humanely. If Gaddafi was executed after capture, this would constitute a war crime." The United Nations launched an investigation into the circumstances of Gaddafi's death, but it faced significant obstacles. Key witnesses were reluctant to speak, physical evidence had been compromised. The chaotic nature of the capture made establishing a definitive sequence of events nearly impossible. What we can say with certainty is that Gaddafi was alive when captured and dead when he arrived in Misrata, concludes UN investigator Ian Martin. The manner of his death remains officially undetermined. At approximately 1:10 p.m., Gaddafi's body was loaded into an ambulance for transport to Misrata. The ambulance driver, Bashir al-Darat, later described the scene. "They brought the body to me wrapped in a blanket. I was told to drive directly to Misrata without stopping. There were fighters with guns who accompanied me. They were celebrating, firing into the air." The medical personnel who received the body in Misrata provide some of the most credible testimony about Gaddafi's condition. Dr. Hazem al-Khatib, who examined the body upon arrival, noted, "There were multiple wounds, but the fatal injury appeared to be a gunshot wound to the left temple, with the bullet exiting through the back of the head. The wound characteristics suggest the shot was fired at close range," Dr. al-Khatib continued. "There was significant powder stippling around the entry wound, indicating the muzzle of the weapon was likely less than 30 centimeters from the skin when fired. This forensic detail is crucial. It effectively rules out the possibility that Gaddafi was killed by random crossfire or a long-distance shot. Someone placed a gun against his head and pulled the trigger. What we're likely seeing here is the culmination of what psychologists call moral disengagement," explains Dr. Emma Richards. After years of portraying Gaddafi as a monster, which, given his actions, wasn't difficult, fighters had effectively dehumanized him. This psychological process makes it easier to commit acts against someone that would normally violate one's moral code. The fighters from Misrata had additional layers of moral justification. They had witnessed firsthand the suffering Gaddafi had inflicted on their community. Many had lost family members to his forces. In their minds, they weren't killing a captured leader, they were delivering justice. News of Gaddafi's death triggered immediate celebrations across Libya. In Misrata, thousands poured into streets that months earlier had been too dangerous to walk. They fired guns into the air, honked car horns, and embraced strangers. For many, it represented not just the end of a dictator, but the promise of a new beginning. Yet, among international observers, the manner of Gaddafi's death raised troubling questions about Libya's future. If the revolution began with calls for justice and human rights, did it undermine its own legitimacy by ending with an apparent execution? The problem with revolutionary justice is that it's inherently selective and emotional, notes conflict resolution expert Dr. Jonathan Marshall. It satisfies immediate desires for retribution, but undermines the establishment of rule of law, something Libya desperately needed after 42 years of personalized rule. For the fighters who captured Gaddafi, such abstract concerns were far removed from the reality they had lived. Many expressed no regrets about his treatment. "You ask about international law?" says former rebel fighter Mahmoud Bey, one of the few willing to speak openly. "Where was international law when Gaddafi was killing our children? Where was it during the 42 years he ruled through fear? We didn't capture a political leader that day. We captured a criminal who had the blood of thousands on his hands." This sentiment that Gaddafi's crimes placed him outside the protection of normal legal standards was widespread among Libyans. Yet it highlighted the central challenge facing post-revolutionary Libya: how to build a society based on rule of law after violently overthrowing a lawless regime. In death, as in life, Gaddafi remained a divisive figure. His body was displayed in an industrial freezer in Misrata for 4 days, allowing thousands of Libyans to view it and confirm for themselves that the dictator was truly gone. Some spat on the corpse, others stood in silent contemplation. Many took photos with their phones, final proof that the man who had dominated their lives was now powerless. On October 25, 2011, Gaddafi was buried in an unmarked grave in the desert, its location kept secret to prevent it from becoming either a shrine or a target for desecration. With his physical presence erased from Libya, the country faced its uncertain future. While rebel fighters celebrated in the streets of Sirte, a very different scene was unfolding in the sterile conference rooms of NATO headquarters in Brussels. Here, military commanders and political representatives gathered around secure video links, receiving real-time updates from the field. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos on the ground in Libya. Admiral James Stavridis, then NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, would later write in his memoir, "When confirmation came through that Gaddafi had been captured, there was no celebration in our command center. Instead, there was a palpable sense of concern about what would happen next, both to him personally and to Libya as a whole." This concern reflected a fundamental truth about Operation Unified Protector, the NATO mission in Libya. From its inception, it had operated in a gray area between humanitarian intervention and regime change. 7 months earlier, on March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council had passed Resolution 1973. The resolution authorized member states to take all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians under threat of attack. Crucially, it explicitly excluded a foreign occupation force of any form on any part of Libyan territory. The resolution was carefully worded, explains international law professor Alexandra Morton. It authorized the creation of a no-fly zone and measures to protect civilians, but it did not explicitly authorize regime change. This constructive ambiguity allowed countries with different agendas to support the same resolution. Russia and China, typically wary of Western military intervention, abstained rather than vetoing the resolution, a decision both nations would later come to regret. Within 48 hours of the resolution's passage, French aircraft were bombing Gaddafi's forces outside Benghazi. American and British ships launched over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles against Libyan air defense systems. What had begun as a civilian protection mission quickly evolved into something more expansive. In Washington, the Obama administration was walking a political tightrope. Still managing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Obama was reluctant to lead another military intervention in a Muslim-majority country. Yet allowing Gaddafi to crush the Libyan uprising would contradict America's stated support for the Arab Spring movements. The solution was what one anonymous White House official described to The New Yorker as leading from behind, providing critical military capabilities while allowing European allies, particularly France and Britain, to take public ownership of the intervention. The command structure was deliberately complex, explains defense analyst Dr. Richard Clark. Operational control was officially under NATO, with Canadian Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard as mission commander. But the real decision-making involved a core group of nations, the US, Britain, France, and Italy, who coordinated strategy through a separate channel. This arrangement allowed the Obama administration to maintain that America was playing a supporting role while still exercising significant influence over the operation's direction. The key players in this geopolitical chess match were a small group of senior officials. In the United States, President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who opposed the intervention, and National Security Advisor Tom Donilon. In France, President Nicolas Sarkozy and Foreign Minister Alain Juppé. In Britain, Prime Minister David Cameron and Foreign Secretary William Hague. These individuals, along with a handful of military commanders and intelligence officials, shaped the intervention that would ultimately lead to Gaddafi's death. Behind the unified public statements lay competing national interests. France, under President Sarkozy, had the most aggressive stance toward Gaddafi. Sarkozy had personal reasons for wanting the Libyan leader removed. Allegations later emerged that Gaddafi had provided illegal funding for Sarkozy's 2007 election campaign, creating a potential scandal if exposed. Beyond personal motivations, France had strategic interests in North Africa, its former colonial sphere of influence. French oil company Total was eager to expand its operations in Libya, where it had historically held less favorable positions than Italian and British companies. Libya has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, approximately 48 billion barrels, notes energy analyst Sarah Peterson. Before the revolution, these resources were managed through Libya's National Oil Corporation, which negotiated contracts heavily favoring the state. Western oil companies saw the conflict as a potential opportunity to renegotiate more favorable terms. Britain's interests were similarly complex. Prime Minister David Cameron, relatively new in office, saw the Libya intervention as an opportunity to demonstrate decisive leadership on the world stage. British petroleum companies, particularly BP, had extensive investments in Libya that had been jeopardized by the uprising. What few people realize is that throughout the conflict, oil companies were already negotiating with the rebel National Transitional Council, reveals former diplomat Richard Dalton. As early as April 2011, representatives from major oil companies were meeting with rebel leaders in Benghazi, discussing how contracts would be structured after Gaddafi's fall. These negotiations occurred while NATO planes were still bombing Gaddafi's forces, a clear indication that despite public statements about protecting civilians, key NATO members were already planning for a post-Gaddafi Libya. America's role was more nuanced. While publicly leading from behind, the US provided critical military capabilities that European allies lacked: advanced intelligence gathering, drone surveillance, electronic warfare, and precision munitions. Without these American assets, the NATO operation would have been significantly less effective. The Europeans simply didn't have the capabilities to run this kind of operation independently, explains military analyst General Jack Keane Rittbert. They lack sufficient precision munitions, aerial refueling capacity, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms. The US provided these critical elements while maintaining a lower public profile. On the day of Gaddafi's capture, senior American officials monitored events from the White House Situation Room. When confirmation came that Gaddafi had been found, the information was immediately relayed to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was preparing for interviews in Kabul, Afghanistan. Between interviews, Clinton received a message on her BlackBerry. Reading it, she exclaimed, "Wow," to an aide. Moments later, still processing the news, she sat down with CBS News reporter Wyatt Andrews. Andrews informed her that there were unconfirmed reports of Gaddafi's capture. Clinton, now on camera but still absorbing the information, responded with a phrase that would come to define the moment.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Followed by a brief laugh. This unguarded moment, lasting just seconds, would become one of the most controversial aspects of America's involvement in Libya. Critics saw it as revealing callous disregard for human life, regardless of Gaddafi's crimes. Supporters viewed it as an unscripted human reaction to the sudden end of a brutal dictator. That brief clip encapsulates the moral ambiguity of the entire Libya intervention, says political scientist Dr. Meredith Sumter. Was this a humanitarian mission to protect civilians that incidentally led to regime change? Or was it always about removing Gaddafi, with humanitarian protection as the justification? The reactions to Gaddafi's death revealed these underlying tensions. French President Sarkozy called it a milestone in Libya's liberation. British Prime Minister Cameron spoke of pride in Britain's role. President Obama was more measured, noting that it marked a momentous day, but emphasizing that Libya faced a long and winding road to democracy. Russia and China, which had abstained rather than vetoing Resolution 1973, expressed concern about how the mission had evolved. Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin criticized NATO for exceeding its mandate, stating bluntly, "Who gave NATO the right to kill Gaddafi?" As Libya began its uncertain transition, the competition for influence and contracts intensified. French companies secured major reconstruction deals, particularly in infrastructure and water systems. British firms focused on the financial sector and oil services. American companies, despite the U.S. military's critical role in the intervention, found themselves at a disadvantage as European nations moved quickly to establish commercial footholds. Libya's oil production, which had virtually stopped during the conflict, resumed surprisingly quickly, notes energy consultant Dr. Ibrahim Wardi. By early 2012, production had reached 1.6 million barrels per day, nearly pre-war levels. This rapid recovery benefited the companies that had secured early agreements with the new authorities. The speed with which commercial interests were secured raised uncomfortable questions about the humanitarian justifications for the intervention. Had protecting civilians been the primary motivation, or had economic and strategic interests played a larger role than publicly acknowledged? Classified documents later revealed that intelligence agencies had provided detailed assessments of Libya's post-Gaddafi economic potential to government officials throughout the conflict. These assessments highlighted opportunities in oil, infrastructure, banking, and telecommunications sectors, where Western companies could gain significant advantages. There's always a mixture of motives in foreign policy, explains former State Department official Dr. Sarah Chase. Humanitarian concerns, strategic interests, economic opportunities. These aren't mutually exclusive. The problem arises when public justifications emphasize one set of motives, while internal decision-making prioritizes others. On October 31, 2011, 11 days after Gaddafi's death, NATO formally ended Operation Unified Protector. In a ceremony at NATO headquarters, Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen declared the mission one of the most successful in NATO history. The alliance had conducted over 26,500 sorties, including approximately 9,700 strike missions, without losing a single service member. For the architects of the intervention, the operation appeared to be a model of successful limited warfare, achieving its objectives without deploying ground troops or suffering casualties. Yet this apparent success obscured a more complex reality. NATO had helped remove a dictator, but had no coherent plan for what would follow. The mission was defined by what it was against, Gaddafi, rather than what it was for, notes conflict resolution expert Dr. Audrey Cronin. This created a fundamental problem. Once the common enemy was removed, the coalition of convenience between Western powers and various Libyan factions began to unravel. As NATO celebrated its military success, Libya was already showing signs of the fragmentation that would eventually lead to civil war. The geopolitical chess masters had achieved checkmate against Gaddafi, but they had failed to anticipate the chaos that would follow his removal from the board. I've spent hundreds of hours researching classified documents to bring you the truth about Gaddafi's final moments. If you leave without subscribing to Crime Frame, you'll never know when the next piece of this puzzle is revealed. The sinking feeling of missing crucial information that others know, don't let that be you. Subscribe now. For 4 days after his death, the body of Muammar Gaddafi lay on a dirty mattress inside an industrial freezer in a Misrata meat market. The man who had once commissioned gold-plated furniture for his palaces and traveled with a 40-person security detail now rested in a commercial refrigeration unit. His body partially covered by a blanket, surrounded by sides of beef and lamb. The decision to display Gaddafi's body publicly represented a collision between modern ethical standards and ancient traditions of warfare. Throughout history, the public exhibition of defeated enemies served both practical and psychological purposes, providing definitive proof of death, while symbolically transferring power from the vanquished to the victors. There's a long historical precedent for this practice, explains historian Dr. Eleanor Matthews. From the ancient Egyptians displaying the bodies of defeated Hittite warriors to Oliver Cromwell's head being exhibited on a pike after his posthumous execution, public display of enemies has served as a powerful visual full stop to a regime's existence. Yet in the context of 21st century international norms, the display raised serious ethical concerns. The Geneva Conventions, which Libya was party to, require that the dead be honorably interred and graves respected and properly maintained. Human rights organizations universally condemn the display as degrading treatment, regardless of Gaddafi's own human rights record. Despite these concerns, thousands of Libyans made the journey to Misrata specifically to view Gaddafi's body. They waited for hours in lines stretching several blocks, enduring the smell of decomposition that grew stronger despite the freezer's efforts. For many, seeing was literally believing. They needed visual confirmation that the man who had dominated their lives was truly gone. "I drove 300 kilometers to see him," said Faraj Lamine, a 52-year-old teacher from Tripoli. For 42 years, his face was everywhere, on every wall, every television, every newspaper. Now I needed to see his face in death, to know for certain that we were free. Others expressed more visceral reactions. Some spat on the body. Others took photos with their phones, posing with thumbs up beside the corpse of their former leader. A few stood in silent contemplation, struggling to reconcile the broken body before them with the larger-than-life figure who had ruled their nation for 2 generations. What we witnessed in that meat locker was a complex psychological process playing out in real time, explains Dr. Mona Ibrahim, specialist in collective trauma. For many Libyans, Gaddafi wasn't just a political leader. He was a psychological presence who had shaped their entire worldview, whether through fear, admiration, or a complex mixture of both. Seeing his body allowed them to begin the process of psychological liberation. This process manifested differently across Libya's diverse population. For those who had suffered directly under the regime, political prisoners, families of the disappeared, residents of cities like Misrata that had endured brutal sieges, viewing the body provided a sense of justice, however rough. For others, particularly those who had benefited from Gaddafi's rule or belonged to tribes aligned with him, the display represented a troubling precedent for the new Libya. Away from public view, medical examiners conducted an autopsy on Gaddafi's body. The official report, released by Libya's new authorities, listed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. However, the report contained significant omissions and inconsistencies that raised questions about its thoroughness and objectivity. The autopsy documentation was substandard by international norms, notes forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Shepard, who reviewed the available evidence. There was inadequate photography, incomplete documentation of all wounds, and no toxicology screening. Most concerning was the lack of detailed analysis of the fatal gunshot wounds, specifically the absence of gunshot residue testing that could have determined firing distance. These omissions fueled speculation about the exact circumstances of Gaddafi's death. The official narrative that he died from a gunshot wound sustained during crossfire between loyalist and rebel forces was contradicted by cell phone footage showing him alive after capture. Yet without a comprehensive forensic investigation, establishing the precise sequence of events remained impossible. Before dawn on October 25, 2011, a small convoy of vehicles left Misrata carrying Gaddafi's body wrapped in a white shroud. They drove deep into the Libyan desert, to an undisclosed location, where he was buried in an unmarked grave. Only a handful of officials and tribal representatives witnessed the burial, which was conducted according to Islamic traditions, despite Gaddafi's unorthodox interpretations of Islam during his lifetime. The decision to keep the burial location secret stemmed from multiple concerns. Government officials feared the grave could become either a shrine for remaining loyalists or a target for desecration by those who had suffered under his rule. There were also security concerns, the possibility that his body might be exhumed and stolen by supporters seeking to create a martyr narrative. The secrecy around Gaddafi's burial reflects the ambiguity of his legacy, notes political anthropologist Dr. Hassan Menemna. Unlike figures like Saddam Hussein, whose graves are known but unremarkable, or Osama bin Laden, who was buried at sea specifically to prevent a gravesite, Gaddafi occupies an uncertain space in death, as he often did in life. Internationally, reactions to Gaddafi's death, particularly the manner of it, revealed deep divisions about the Libya intervention. The United Nations Human Rights Council called for an investigation into the circumstances, with then-Commissioner Navi Pillay stating, "There are disturbing reports emerging of the circumstances under which Colonel Gaddafi was killed, and there should be some kind of investigation." Western leaders who had supported the NATO intervention found themselves in an awkward position, celebrating the end of Gaddafi's regime while expressing concern about the apparent execution of a captured combatant. President Obama noted that Gaddafi had an opportunity to embrace democratic reform, but chose violence. British Prime Minister David Cameron spoke of pride in Britain's role, but acknowledged questions about how Gaddafi died. Nations that had opposed or questioned the intervention were more critical. Russia's Vladimir Putin asked pointedly, who had the right to execute him, even if he was a dictator? South African President Jacob Zuma, who had attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution, called the manner of Gaddafi's death disturbing and warned it set a dangerous precedent. The United Nations established a commission of inquiry to investigate alleged violations of international law during the conflict, including Gaddafi's death. Their report, released in March 2012, concluded that the commission has not been able to confirm the death of Muammar Gaddafi as an unlawful killing and considers that further investigation is required. This diplomatic language reflected the practical challenges facing investigators. Key witnesses were reluctant to speak, physical evidence had been compromised, and Libya's transitional authorities had limited interest in pursuing a case that might implicate the very fighters they celebrated as liberators. As international attention shifted away from Libya, the country began its descent into chaos. The National Transitional Council, which had served as the political face of the revolution, struggled to establish legitimate governance. More significantly, the various militias that had fought Gaddafi refused to disarm or integrate into a national military structure. What many outside observers failed to appreciate was that the Libyan revolution was never a unified movement, explains conflict analyst Dr. Mary Kaldor. It was a temporary alliance of convenience between groups with vastly different visions for Libya's future: secular Democrats, Islamists, tribal factions, regional separatists, and opportunists. Once Gaddafi was gone, these differences quickly surfaced. By early 2012, Libya had effectively fragmented into territories controlled by competing militias. Misrata's powerful brigades controlled the central coast. Zintan militias held sway in the western mountains. Islamist groups dominated Benghazi and parts of eastern Libya. In the south, tribal and ethnic factions established local control. The central government in Tripoli, lacking both military power and popular legitimacy, proved unable to impose its authority. In 2014, this fragmentation erupted into open civil war when Khalifa Haftar, a former Gaddafi-era general who had returned from exile in the United States, launched Operation Dignity against Islamist militias in Benghazi. The conflict quickly escalated, drawing in regional powers with competing interests. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates backed Haftar's forces, while Turkey and Qatar supported his opponents. Libya became a proxy battleground for wider regional rivalries, with the civilian population bearing the brunt of the violence. Perhaps the most alarming development came in 2015, when the Islamic State ISIS established a significant presence in Libya, seizing control of Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte. In a bitter irony, the same drainage pipes where Gaddafi had sought his final refuge became part of ISIS territory. The group released propaganda videos showing executions carried out on the same beaches where Gaddafi's forces had once held military parades. ISIS deliberately targeted Libya for expansion, explains terrorism analyst Dr. Hassan Abbas. They recognized several advantages: Libya's strategic location near Europe, its vast ungoverned spaces, its weapons stockpiles, and most importantly, the governance vacuum created by Gaddafi's fall. Without an effective succession plan, the group's rise in Libya represented a direct consequence of the intervention's fundamental flaw. It had successfully removed a dictator, but failed to ensure a stable transition. In the security vacuum that followed, extremist ideologies found fertile ground. The chaos also transformed Libya into the primary transit point for migrants attempting to reach Europe from sub-Saharan Africa. Human traffickers exploited the lawlessness, establishing a brutal industry that subjected migrants to detention, extortion, forced labor, and sexual violence. The Mediterranean Sea became a graveyard for thousands who drowned attempting the crossing in overcrowded, unseaworthy vessels. For ordinary Libyans, the aftermath of Gaddafi's fall brought deteriorating living conditions. Power outages became routine, water systems failed, healthcare collapsed, banking systems ceased functioning normally. The oil-rich nation that once boasted the highest human development index in Africa descended into a failed state where basic services could no longer be guaranteed. Under Gaddafi, we had no freedom, but we had security and services, reflects Aisha Mahmoud, a mother of 4 from Tripoli. Now we have theoretical freedom, but no security and no services. My children haven't attended school regularly in years because it's too dangerous. Is this what liberation looks like? This sentiment that Libya exchanged one form of suffering for another became increasingly common as the country fractured further. The revolution that began with such hope in February 2011 had, by its 10th anniversary, produced a nation divided between competing governments, plagued by militia violence and exploited by foreign powers. The drainage pipes where Muammar Gaddafi spent his final moments stand as a stark symbol of Libya's trajectory, from the fall of a dictator to the collapse of a state. What began as a popular uprising inspired by democratic aspirations across the Arab world devolved into a cautionary tale about the dangers of intervention without adequate planning for the aftermath. As one Libyan proverb warns, it is easier to release the lion from its cage than to return it once it has escaped. In the case of Libya, removing Gaddafi proved far simpler than building the stable, democratic society that was promised to follow his fall. To understand the man who died in that drainage pipe, we must return to the beginning, to a young Bedouin boy born in a goat hair tent near Sirte around 1942. Muammar Gaddafi's early life was shaped by poverty and colonial humiliation. His formative years coincided with Libya's struggle for independence from Italian colonization and then British and French administration. The son of a nomadic goat and camel herder, Gaddafi was the first in his family to receive formal education. Despite his humble origins, he displayed remarkable intelligence and determination, walking miles to school and often sleeping in mosques during the week. At school, he faced ridicule from wealthier students for his Bedouin background, an experience that fueled a lifelong resentment toward Libya's traditional elites. Like many young Arabs of his generation, Gaddafi found inspiration in the pan-Arab nationalism of Egypt's charismatic leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser's fiery speeches about Arab dignity and his defiance of Western powers resonated deeply with the young Libyan. When Gaddafi entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi in 1963, he carried these revolutionary ideas with him. During his military training, Gaddafi methodically identified and recruited like-minded officers who shared his revolutionary vision. Together they formed the Free Officers Movement, a clandestine group modeled after the Egyptian organization that had brought Nasser to power. Their goal was simple but ambitious: overthrow the monarchy and establish a revolutionary republic. King Idris, Libya's elderly monarch, had ruled since independence in 1951. While respected for his role in achieving independence, his government was widely perceived as corrupt and too closely aligned with Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, who maintained military bases on Libyan soil in exchange for economic aid. On September 1, 1969, while King Idris was in Turkey for medical treatment, Gaddafi and his fellow officers made their move. In a meticulously planned operation, they seized key installations in Tripoli and Benghazi: radio stations, police headquarters, government offices, and the central bank. The coup was remarkably bloodless. Most Libyans woke to find they had a new government without a shot being fired in resistance. "People of Libya," announced a 27-year-old Gaddafi over national radio. "Your armed forces have undertaken the overthrow of the reactionary and corrupt regime, the stooges of colonialism and imperialism. From this day forward, Libya is a free, sovereign republic." The young officers established the Revolutionary Command Council (RCC) with Gaddafi as its chairman. Initially, many Libyans welcomed the change, hoping for greater independence from foreign influence and a more equitable distribution of the country's recently discovered oil wealth. Gaddafi's early years in power seemed to fulfill these hopes. His government nationalized oil companies, securing better terms that increased Libya's revenue from $40 million in 1969 to $1 billion by 1971. This wealth funded ambitious public works, new roads, schools, hospitals, and housing projects. Literacy rates rose dramatically as education became universally accessible. He would travel to villages personally, recalls Ibrahim al-Sharif, who worked in the education ministry during this period. He would sit with elders, drink tea, listen to their concerns. People felt for the first time that their leader cared about their lives. Women were encouraged to pursue education and careers. There was genuine optimism about Libya's future. Gaddafi also fulfilled his nationalist promises, negotiating the closure of British and American military bases and removing visible symbols of Western influence. For a population that had endured Italian colonization and then foreign military presence, these actions generated significant popular support. In 1975, Gaddafi published the first volume of his Green Book, outlining his political philosophy, a unique blend of socialism, Islam, Arab nationalism, and direct democracy that he called the Third Universal Theory. The book became required reading for all Libyans and formed the theoretical basis for a complete restructuring of Libyan society. Traditional government ministries were abolished, replaced by people's committees and revolutionary committees. The country was renamed the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, a made-up word meaning roughly state of the masses. Gaddafi himself rejected any official title, calling himself simply the brother leader or guide of the revolution. But beneath these revolutionary trappings, a darker reality was emerging. Political opposition became increasingly dangerous. Public executions of enemies of the revolution were broadcast on state television. Students suspected of opposition activities were hanged in university squares as warnings to others. A pervasive intelligence apparatus monitored citizens for any sign of dissent. No single event better illustrates the brutality of Gaddafi's regime than the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre. Following a protest over poor conditions and restricted family visits, security forces opened fire on approximately 1,200 prisoners gathered in the facility's courtyards. The killing continued for hours, with bodies later removed by bulldozers and buried in mass graves. "They told us to gather in the courtyards," recalls Ahmed Ramadan, one of the few survivors. "When we were all assembled, the guards moved to the rooftops. There was no warning, they just opened fire with machine guns. People were falling everywhere. The shooting continued until no one was standing. I survived by falling early and lying under other bodies." The government denied the massacre for years. Families continued to bring clothes and food for relatives who were already dead, with prison officials accepting these items to maintain the fiction that the prisoners were still alive. It wasn't until 2004 that Gaddafi acknowledged something had happened at Abu Salim, though he claimed only 200 had died. Beyond Libya's borders, Gaddafi established himself as a leading sponsor of international terrorism. The 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people, including 190 Americans, stands as the most notorious attack linked to his regime. After years of denials and international sanctions, Libya finally accepted responsibility for the bombing in 2003, though Gaddafi never personally admitted ordering the attack. Other terrorist acts attributed to Gaddafi's regime included the 1986 bombing of La Belle Discotheque in West Berlin, which killed 3 people, including 2 U.S. servicemen. The 1989 bombing of UTA Flight 772 over Niger, killing 170, and support for numerous terrorist organizations, including the Irish Republican Army, the Red Army faction, and various Palestinian militant groups. These activities earned Gaddafi the enmity of Western nations, particularly the United States. President Ronald Reagan famously called him the mad dog of the Middle East, and ordered airstrikes against Libya in 1986. Targeting Gaddafi's compound and killing his adopted infant daughter. The attack seemed to intensify Gaddafi's anti-Western stance and his support for terrorist organizations. The September 11, 2001 attacks marked a turning point in Gaddafi's relationship with the West. Recognizing that the global landscape had shifted dramatically, and fearing Libya might become a target in America's war on terror, Gaddafi made a strategic decision to rehabilitate his international image. In December 2003, Libya announced it would abandon its programs to develop weapons of mass destruction and allow international inspectors full access to its facilities. This dramatic reversal opened the door to Libya's reintegration into the international community. Sanctions were lifted, diplomatic relations restored, and Western oil companies returned to Libyan oil fields. The rehabilitation was remarkably swift and complete. By 2004, British Prime Minister Tony Blair was shaking hands with Gaddafi in his desert tent outside Tripoli. In 2008, U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice met with the Libyan leader, marking the highest-level U.S. visit to Libya since 1953. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi even kissed Gaddafi's hand at a summit in 2010. Western businesses rushed to capitalize on Libya's reopening. Oil companies secured new exploration rights. Defense contractors negotiated arms deals. Construction firms bid on infrastructure projects. Universities established exchange programs. After decades of isolation, Libya was suddenly courted by the very nations that had once condemned it. Throughout this period, Gaddafi cultivated an increasingly eccentric public persona. He traveled with a cadre of female bodyguards and insisted on staying in a Bedouin tent during foreign visits, including pitching one on Donald Trump's estate in New York. His rambling speeches at international forums, including a 96-minute address to the UN General Assembly in 2009, became legendary for their incoherence. Gaddafi's public behavior exhibited classic traits of malignant narcissism, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Gerald Post. The grandiosity, the need for constant admiration, the belief in his own exceptional status, these are hallmarks of the condition. But what made Gaddafi particularly dangerous was the combination of narcissism with paranoia and a willingness to use violence against perceived enemies. This psychological profile helps explain the strange contradictions that defined Gaddafi. He positioned himself as a champion of African unity, while funding rebel groups that destabilized neighboring countries. He preached direct democracy through his Jamahiriya system while maintaining absolute personal control. He advocated women's rights while allegedly maintaining a cadre of young female bodyguards who were reportedly subjected to sexual abuse. Perhaps the most telling contradiction was between his public advocacy for simple Bedouin values and his family's extraordinary opulence. When rebels stormed his Tripoli compound in August 2011, they discovered gold-plated furniture, crystal chandeliers, indoor swimming pools, and a collection of luxury vehicles, all while many ordinary Libyans struggled economically despite the country's oil wealth. When the Arab Spring erupted in neighboring Tunisia and Egypt in early 2011, few expected Libya would follow. Despite simmering discontent, Gaddafi's security apparatus had effectively suppressed opposition for decades. Yet on February 17, 2011, protests broke out in Benghazi, quickly spreading to other cities. The regime's violent response, deploying snipers against unarmed protesters, only fueled the uprising. Gaddafi's response revealed his fundamental inability to comprehend the changing reality. In a rambling speech from a bombed-out building in Tripoli, he vowed to hunt down protesters inch by inch, room by room, home by home, alley by alley. He dismissed the protesters as rats and drug addicts. Most tellingly, he seemed genuinely bewildered that his people would turn against him. That final speech shows a man who had lost touch with reality, explains political psychologist Dr. Gerald Post. After 42 years of absolute power, surrounded by sycophants who reinforced his worldview, Gaddafi was psychologically incapable of recognizing that genuine popular opposition existed. In his mind, any opposition had to be the result of foreign conspiracy or drugs or mental illness, not legitimate grievances against his rule. This psychological rigidity, the inability to adapt to changing circumstances or recognize the legitimacy of others' perspectives, would ultimately lead Gaddafi to reject opportunities to negotiate a peaceful exit. Even as his regime crumbled around him, he remained convinced that his people still loved him and would rise up to defend him. In one of his final interviews conducted in April 2011, Gaddafi was asked about the possibility of leaving Libya. His response was revealing. "They love me. All my people are with me. They love me all. They will die to protect me, my people." Whether this represented genuine delusion or calculated defiance remains debated by psychological experts. The journey from the young idealistic officer who seized power in a bloodless coup to the disheveled figure pulled from a drainage pipe spans 42 years of Libyan history. It encompasses moments of genuine reform and horrific repression, international terrorism and diplomatic rehabilitation, bizarre public behavior and calculated political maneuvering. Understanding this complex historical context doesn't justify or excuse the brutality of Gaddafi's regime. Rather, it helps explain how a revolution that began with such promise in 1969 could devolve into decades of repression, and how a leader once welcomed by his people could end his days fleeing from them through the streets of his hometown. Right now, there are viewers just like you who have already subscribed to Crime Frame and are receiving notifications about our upcoming investigation into classified documents never before revealed to the public. The fear of missing out is real, especially when it comes to understanding the events that shaped our world. Don't be left wondering what others now know. Join our community today. More than a decade after Gaddafi's death, Libya bears little resemblance to the democratic success story that intervention advocates once promised. The country remains fractured between competing governments, each backed by different militias and foreign powers. Oil production, the lifeblood of Libya's economy, fluctuates wildly depending on which faction controls key facilities. Basic services that Libyans once took for granted, consistent electricity, clean water, functional hospitals, have become luxuries available only sporadically. Libya today meets every definition of a failed state, explains political scientist Dr. Robert Rotberg, who specializes in state failure and collapse. It lacks a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its borders. It cannot deliver public services to its population. It cannot interact with other states as a full member of the international community. Most critically, it has ceased to be the primary decision-making body for its nominal territory. This state failure has produced consequences that extend far beyond Libya's borders. creating ripple effects across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Perhaps the most visible consequence has been the refugee and migrant crisis. Before 2011, Gaddafi's government, despite its many abuses, maintained effective control of Libya's 1,100-mile Mediterranean coastline, preventing large-scale irregular migration to Europe. This control was part of agreements with European nations, particularly Italy, which provided Libya with billions in investment in exchange for migration enforcement. The numbers tell a staggering story, notes migration researcher Dr. Paolo Catita. In 2010, approximately 4,500 migrants reached Italy from Libya by sea. By 2016, that number had increased to over 181,000. Since Gaddafi's fall, an estimated 20,000 people have drowned attempting the crossing. For those who survive the perilous journey, the conditions they flee are horrific. Libya has become a lawless space where migrants from sub-Saharan Africa face detention, torture, sexual violence, and forced labor. Undercover investigations have revealed slave markets where human beings are bought and sold for as little as $400. Another devastating consequence has been the proliferation of weapons across North Africa and the Sahel region. Under Gaddafi, Libya maintained one of the largest weapons stockpiles in Africa, an estimated 250,000 to 700,000 firearms, as well as more sophisticated systems including surface-to-air missiles, artillery pieces, and chemical weapons precursors. When his regime collapsed, these weapons storage facilities were looted. The arms flowed south and west, fueling conflicts in Mali, Niger, Chad, and as far away as Syria and the Sinai Peninsula. We can trace direct lines between Libya's collapse and the expansion of terrorist groups across the Sahel, explains counterterrorism analyst Dr. Catherine Zimmerman. Groups like Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and various ISIS affiliates have all benefited from the weapons, training, and ungoverned spaces that emerged from Libya's implosion. The human cost of this weapons proliferation is measured in thousands of lives lost in conflicts that might otherwise have remained localized or been resolved peacefully. Villages razed in northern Nigeria, tourist resorts attacked in Burkina Faso, peacekeepers ambushed in Mali, all bear the fingerprints of weapons that once belonged to Gaddafi's arsenals. Within Western military and diplomatic circles, Libya has become a cautionary tale, a case study in the unintended consequences of military intervention without adequate planning for the aftermath. The doctrine of responsibility to protect, R2P, which provided the moral and legal justification for the intervention, has been significantly weakened by Libya's outcome. Libya fundamentally changed how we approach the question of humanitarian intervention, admits former State Department official Dr. Sarah Sewall. There was a genuine belief that removing Gaddafi would allow Libya's natural democratic tendencies to flourish. What we failed to appreciate was how thoroughly he had destroyed the country's institutions over 42 years. There was simply no foundation upon which to build. This reassessment has had tangible effects on subsequent international crises. When Syria descended into civil war shortly after the Libya intervention, Western powers proved far more reluctant to intervene militarily, despite death tolls that far exceeded those in Libya. The ghosts of Libya's failed intervention have haunted every subsequent debate about humanitarian military action. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that Gaddafi himself predicted the chaos that would follow his removal. In a March 2011 interview, as NATO airstrikes began, he warned, "Libya will become like Somalia. Libya will become a base for Al-Qaeda. There will be a river of blood. The Mediterranean will become a sea of chaos." In another statement that proved eerily prescient, he told reporters, "There are millions of blacks who could come to the Mediterranean to cross to France and Italy, and Libya plays a role in security in the Mediterranean." These warnings were dismissed at the time as the desperate rhetoric of a cornered dictator. A decade later, they read like a disturbingly accurate forecast of what was to come. For ordinary Libyans, the legacy of the revolution and intervention produces deeply mixed feelings. Fatima Khalil, a 45-year-old teacher in Tripoli, reflects, "Under Gaddafi, I couldn't speak freely, but my children were safe walking to school. Now I can criticize the government, but which government? There are two, and neither can protect us or provide basic services." Ahmed Bashir, a 62-year-old engineer, offers a different perspective. "People forget how it was before. If you spoke against Gaddafi, you disappeared. Your family would never know what happened to you. Yes, we have problems now, serious problems. But at least we have the possibility of building something better. Under him, there was no possibility, only fear." These contrasting views reflect a fundamental divide in how Libyans assess their recent history. For some, particularly those who suffered direct repression under Gaddafi, no price was too high for freedom from his rule. For others, especially those who have lost family members to post-revolution violence or who struggle with deteriorating living conditions, the cost has seemed increasingly questionable. What could have been done differently? This question has occupied military strategists, diplomats, and humanitarian experts for years. Their analyses suggest several critical junctures where alternative approaches might have produced better outcomes. The first mistake was the expansion of the mission from civilian protection to regime change, argues international law professor Mary Ellen O'Connell. UN Resolution 1973 authorized the protection of civilians under threat. Using that authorization to actively pursue Gaddafi's overthrow undermined the legal basis for the intervention and created distrust that has hampered subsequent humanitarian efforts. Military strategist General David Richards, RETER, identifies a different critical error. Once the decision for regime change was made, the refusal to commit ground forces or peacekeepers created an impossible situation. You cannot conduct a successful intervention from 30,000 feet. Someone needs to secure weapons depots, maintain order, and prevent reprisals. NATO had no plan for this critical phase. Development expert Dr. Paul Collier points to economic factors. Libya's oil wealth should have been a blessing for post-Gaddafi reconstruction. Instead, control of oil facilities became a primary driver of conflict. A neutral international body should have been established to manage oil revenues during the transition, ensuring all Libyans benefited regardless of which faction controlled their region. The human cost of these strategic failures is written across Libya's landscape in bombed-out schools that haven't been rebuilt, in hospitals operating without reliable electricity, in mass graves still being discovered years after the fighting supposedly ended. It's measured in the estimated 25,000 Libyans killed during the revolution and its aftermath, in the 200,000 internally displaced persons who cannot return to their homes, in the millions who live with chronic insecurity and economic hardship in a country that, on paper, remains one of Africa's wealthiest due to its oil reserves. What we're witnessing in Libya is a form of collective trauma, explains psychologist Dr. Hala Alian, who specializes in conflict zones. An entire generation is growing up knowing nothing but instability and violence. This creates profound psychological effects: chronic anxiety, depression, normalized violence, and a fundamental inability to plan for the future. These psychological wounds will take generations to heal, long after the physical infrastructure is rebuilt. This generational trauma represents perhaps the most lasting and damaging legacy of the intervention. Children who were infants when Gaddafi fell are now entering adolescence, having never known a stable Libya. Their understanding of their country's history and potential is shaped entirely by its post-revolution chaos. 16-year-old Malik, attending classes in a repurposed shipping container in Benghazi, represents this generation. My teachers tell us Libya was once a respected country with good universities and hospitals. He says, it's hard to believe. All I've known is fighting and shortages. My dream is just to live somewhere with 24-hour electricity. The contrast with pre-revolution Libya is stark. For all its repression and eccentricity, Gaddafi's regime had achieved significant development milestones. Libya once boasted the highest human development index in Africa. Its literacy rate exceeded 80%. Its healthcare system, while flawed, provided universal coverage. Women enjoyed educational and professional opportunities rare in the region. These achievements don't excuse or justify the regime's brutality, but they help explain why many Libyans feel a complex nostalgia for aspects of the pre-revolution era, particularly as the promised benefits of Gaddafi's removal have failed to materialize. The international community has made repeated attempts to resolve Libya's crisis through diplomatic means. The Skhirat Agreement in 2015, the Paris Conference in 2018, the Berlin Conference in 2020, each produced hopeful communiques and photo opportunities, but little lasting progress on the ground. These diplomatic failures stem from a fundamental reality. The international powers claiming to support Libya's reunification are often the same ones arming and funding its various factions. Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, Turkey, Qatar, each backs different proxies in Libya's ongoing conflict, making genuine resolution nearly impossible. The drainage pipes where Muammar Gaddafi spent his final moments stand as a powerful symbol of intervention's unintended consequences. What began as a mission to protect civilians evolved into regime change without adequate planning for what would follow. The result has been not freedom and democracy, but fragmentation and suffering. This doesn't mean the international community should never intervene in humanitarian crises. Rather, Libya teaches us that how we intervene matters as much as whether we intervene. Military action without comprehensive political, economic, and security planning may remove a dictator, but it cannot build a functioning state. For Libya's youngest generation, these geopolitical lessons offer little comfort. They inherit a fractured country with depleted institutions, traumatized communities, and ongoing conflict. Their future depends not just on Libya's internal reconciliation, but on whether the international community will acknowledge its responsibility for the current situation and provide the long-term support needed for genuine recovery. Gaddafi once warned, "After me, the flood." The years since his death have given these words a prophetic quality. Yet Libya's story is still being written. Its oil wealth, strategic location, and resilient population provide the potential for recovery if the right conditions can be created. The ultimate legacy of the intervention may depend on whether the international community learns from its mistakes in Libya, whether future interventions incorporate comprehensive planning for the day after, whether the principle of protecting civilians can be separated from the politics of regime change, and whether the Libyan people themselves can find a path to reconciliation after a decade of conflict. The answers to these questions will determine not just Libya's future, but how we approach humanitarian crises for generations to come. For now, the drainage pipes outside Sirte stand as a silent reminder of how quickly triumph can turn to tragedy when we fail to plan for peace with the same diligence we plan for war. I stand once more where it all ended, the unremarkable roadside outside Sirte, where history pivoted on October 20th, 2011. The drainage pipes that briefly sheltered Muammar Gaddafi in his final desperate moments remain, though few who pass by recognize their significance. No memorial marks the spot. No plaque commemorates what happened here, just concrete culverts slowly eroding under the harsh Libyan sun. Time has a way of stripping events of their immediacy, transforming raw emotion into historical analysis. The blood has long since washed away. The shouting voices have faded. What remains are questions about justice, vengeance, and the thin line that separates them. Was Gaddafi's death justice for the countless Libyans who suffered under his 42-year rule? For the families of Abu Salim prison massacre victims? For those who disappeared into his regime's detention centers? Many Libyans would answer unequivocally, yes. Yet international law draws clear distinctions between justice and vengeance. Justice requires process, charges, evidence, defense, judgment. What happened in these drainage pipes and on the roadside above was something more primal, the raw, unfiltered vengeance of a population finally unleashed against its tormentor. Gaddafi died while under indictment by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. His death ensured he would never face those charges, never have to answer for his actions in a court of law. For some, this represents justice denied, not just for his victims who deserved their day in court, but for history itself, which lost the opportunity to create a complete record of his crimes. Other deposed leaders have faced formal justice: Iraq's Saddam Hussein, Liberia's Charles Taylor, Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic. Their trials, whatever their flaws, created historical records and legal precedents. They demonstrated that no leader stands entirely above the law. Gaddafi's roadside death offered catharsis, but denied closure. The manner of his death also left crucial questions unanswered. Who actually fired the fatal shot? Was it a rebel fighter delivering vigilante justice? Or was Gaddafi caught in crossfire as official accounts claim? Did NATO forces know he was in the convoy when they ordered the airstrike? Was there an explicit or implicit understanding that Gaddafi should not be taken alive? These questions may never be fully answered. Key witnesses have themselves died in Libya's ongoing violence. Official documents remain classified. Those who know the full truth have strong incentives to keep it hidden. Like so many pivotal historical moments, Gaddafi's final hours exist in a gray area between documented fact and speculation. This ambiguity itself serves a purpose, explains historian Dr. Margaret Macmillan. It allows different constituencies to maintain their preferred narratives. Those who wanted Gaddafi punished can believe he received justice. Those who preferred legal process can blame rogue elements. International actors can maintain plausible deniability about their true intentions. Perhaps this ambiguity explains why the drainage pipes remain unmarked. They represent not just the death of a dictator, but the messy, morally complex reality of how power changes hands, a reality far removed from the neat narratives we prefer about justice, triumphing over tyranny. Understanding these complexities matters beyond Libya. In classrooms across America and Britain, the Arab Spring and its aftermath are now taught as history. How we frame these events as triumph or tragedy, as liberation or chaos, shapes how future generations understand the use of military power and the responsibilities that come with intervention. The lessons of Libya have influenced every major international crisis since 2011. When Syria's civil war escalated, Western powers hesitated to intervene directly, haunted by Libya's aftermath. When Russia annexed Crimea, it explicitly cited Libya as justification, claiming the West had abused UN resolutions to pursue regime change. When Yemen descended into conflict, the international response was muted. The appetite for humanitarian intervention diminished. Meanwhile, Libya itself remains a fractured state, a living laboratory, demonstrating the consequences of removing a dictator without adequate planning for what follows. Its ongoing instability serves as both warning and justification, a warning about the limits of military intervention, and a justification for those who prefer to leave even brutal dictators in place, rather than risk the chaos that might follow their removal. Among the few items recovered from Gaddafi's final days was a small collection of personal effects: his trademark sunglasses, a gold-plated pistol, and reportedly, a dog-eared copy of his Green Book. These mundane objects humanize a figure often portrayed as monstrous. They remind us that even dictators are human beings, complex individuals whose choices shape and are shaped by the circumstances they inhabit. This human dimension is crucial to understanding not just Gaddafi but all authoritarian leaders, explains political psychologist Dr. Gerald Post. When we reduce them to cartoon villains, we miss the psychological and social processes that allow such figures to emerge and maintain power. We comfort ourselves with the fiction that they are aberrations, rather than products of recognizable human tendencies toward power and control. This more nuanced understanding doesn't diminish Gaddafi's crimes or absolve him of responsibility. Rather, it helps us recognize the conditions that allow such leaders to emerge, conditions that continue to exist in many societies today. Around the world, authoritarian leadership is experiencing a resurgence. From Eastern Europe to South America, from Asia to the Middle East, leaders are consolidating power, restricting press freedom, and undermining democratic institutions. Many employ rhetoric strikingly similar to Gaddafi's early revolutionary language, promising to restore national pride, protect traditional values, and stand against foreign interference. The parallels are not exact, but they are instructive. Today's aspiring autocrats study the successes and failures of their predecessors. They have learned to maintain the appearance of democratic legitimacy while hollowing out democratic institutions from within. They have mastered the use of modern media to shape narrative and discredit opposition. They have developed more sophisticated methods of control than Gaddafi's often brutal directness. As day turns to evening, at this unremarkable roadside, the shadows lengthen across the drainage pipes. Soon they will disappear into darkness, just as the memory of what happened here gradually fades from public consciousness. New crises emerge, new figures dominate headlines. The cycle continues. Yet for Libyans, the consequences of that October day in 2011 remain immediate and tangible. They live with its aftermath every day in the ongoing violence, the political uncertainty, the economic hardship. Their experience stands as testimony to both the necessity of confronting tyranny and the responsibility to plan carefully for what follows its demise. For the wider world, Libya represents a case study in the limits of good intentions. The intervention began with the genuine desire to protect civilians from imminent massacre. It expanded based on the belief that removing Gaddafi would allow democracy to flourish. It concluded with celebrations of liberation. Yet what followed has challenged our assumptions about how change occurs and what responsibilities accompany the use of military force. Throughout history, certain events have forced fundamental reassessments of international relations. The Treaty of Westphalia established the principle of state sovereignty. The Congress of Vienna created the concept of a balance of power. The founding of the United Nations institutionalized collective security. In its own way, the Libya intervention and its aftermath may represent such a watershed, a moment that compels reconsideration of when and how the international community should intervene in sovereign states. Libya's story continues to unfold. Despite the ongoing conflict, signs of resilience emerge. civil society organizations persist against tremendous odds. Young Libyans find ways to build community and create meaning amid chaos. The human capacity for adaptation and hope remains undiminished, even in the most challenging circumstances. As we pull back from these drainage pipes, this unremarkable spot where a remarkable history pivoted, we're left with the understanding that no historical event has a single meaning or lesson. The same moment can represent justice and injustice, liberation and chaos, the end of one story and the beginning of another. What happened here on October 20th, 2011 will be interpreted and reinterpreted for generations to come. Each interpretation will reflect not just historical facts, but the values, assumptions, and experiences of those doing the interpreting. This is how history works, not as a fixed narrative, but as an ongoing conversation between past and present, between what happened and what it means. Our responsibility, as witnesses to history, is to approach these complex events with humility and nuance, to resist simple narratives that comfort but mislead, to acknowledge uncomfortable truths alongside inspiring ones, and to recognize that understanding the past in all its complexity is essential to navigating the present and shaping a better future. Every day that passes, crucial witnesses to these events are disappearing, taking their secrets to the grave. By subscribing to Crime Frame now, you're not just following a channel, you're preserving history and ensuring these stories aren't forgotten or distorted. The regret of realizing too late that you missed the chance to understand what really happened. Don't let that feeling haunt you. Join us now before it's too late.